Welcome back, everyone. We're going to have our second session on bushfire recovery now after morning tea. And we're going to have our first online speaker as our keynote speaker for this session. So our keynote speaker is Dr. Jodi Price. She's a senior lecturer in vegetation management, restoration and fire ecology at the local university here at Charles Sturt University. She's a plant community ecologist, keen interest in management, restoration of grasslands in particular, and grassy woodlands. Jodi's research group works on a range of applied ecology projects, topics such as plant diversity, restoration ecology, seed ecology, fire ecology, and grazing management. Jodi's talk today is on management and restoration of temperate grasslands. And so Jodi's online, so hopefully when we click over in about 45 seconds, her talk will start on the screen.
Hi everyone, so I'm Jodi Price and I'm based at Charles Sturt Uni here in Albury, and today I'm going to talk about grassland management and restoration with a focus on fire, grazing and seeds. And the work I'm presenting here involves many collaborators and students, and I'll acknowledge them as we go through the talk. I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where this research was conducted, so that is Jaja Wurrung and Barapa peoples. So temperate grasslands in southeastern Australia are critically endangered, and this is due to widespread loss and reduction in their pre-European extent. And the remaining remnants are often small, fragmented and degraded through land use, with the best remnants often occurring along rail lines, roadsides and cemeteries. And these are areas that have escaped heavy grazing and have often retained some regular burning. Now, there's been lots of research done on temperate grasslands, and much of that stems from a legacy of this guy, Bob Parsons, who did some pioneering work in the 70s that recognised that grassland condition was largely a function of its disturbance regime. So he found that sites that were grazed by stock had reductions in diversity compared to remnants that were regularly burned. And also recognise that you get different species composition according to land use type. And so he hypothesised that grasslands were similar prior to European colonisation, and then they had diverged according to this disturbance regime based on species tolerances to different disturbances. Then these two, who were Bob's ecological babies in the 90s, commenced what would be 3 decades and counting of grassland research. And much of what we know about temperate grasslands now stems from this legacy of Bob, John and Ian, and many students that they have trained and mentored, which includes me. And so from these decades of research, we know that land use history affects composition and diversity. So we know that disturbances such as fire and grazing are really important in determining the condition of the grassland, species composition, diversity. We know that when frequent burning is relaxed, that species can go locally extinct. So we know the importance of fire in maintaining diversity in productive grasslands. And this is related to the third major finding, that many intertussock species are poor competitors, and so they require some kind of disturbance to free up space resources. And the fourth thing is that it's generally thought that grassland species have transient seed banks. So these findings have all been directly related to the role of fire in grasslands, specifically that regular fire promotes diversity by reducing competition from dominant tussock grasses and enables smaller intertussock species to recruit and persist. So it's requiring some kind of regular biomass removal to promote diversity. Now, despite all this research, there are still questions that remain around the management and restoration of degraded grasslands, and these are the things that I want to talk about today. So from this earlier research, we know that we see this ecological segregation where we get different species composition based on the long-term management. So again, related to those species tolerances of different disturbances. Now, we know less about recovery of grasslands when management shifts from one disturbance to another. For example, and the first question I'll look at today is, can we overcome land use legacies when we switch from, for example, grazing to fire? Now, the second question I want to address is around the role of fire in grasslands. And so we know a lot about this already. We know that fire is important in maintaining diversity. Now, what I want to look at today is what happens when we reintroduce fire into sites that have been unburnt for a long time. So this is obviously related to the first question about switching disturbance types. And finally, I want to talk about seeds. So I want to talk about the seed germination requirements and seed longevity of grassland species. So grasslands have experienced major shifts in disturbance regimes with the removal of Indigenous fire and the introduction of stock grazing. And this has resulted in the local extinction of fire-dependent and grazing-sensitive species. It's also led to an increase in exotic species. And we know a fair bit about this transition. Now, we know much less about more recent shifts in disturbance type, which can involve the removal of stock grazing and the reintroduction of fire. Now, this is becoming more common as more grassy ecosystems have become part of the conservation estate or where we've seen shifts in management. So the question that can be asked is restoration possible if we shift back to something that resembles a more historical disturbance regime? And this is also becoming more possible with increased opportunities to reinstate cultural fire into Southern Australia. So as a starting point, we first wanted to review what was known about disturbance switches. So we reviewed the literature on all studies that examine changes in disturbance type in temperate grasslands in southeastern Australia. And this was some work that was done with Nick Schultz from FedU, Josh Hodges and Michael Cleland, who are my students, and John Morgan. Now, in our review, we found 45 cases that had tested switches in disturbance type. And we classified these according to 4 main switches. So the first one was abandonment, so where you go from having regular disturbance to no disturbance, and we found 18 cases of this. The second example was when you had an introduction of disturbance where there was no disturbance in recent history, so from no disturbance to disturbance, and in this case we had the introduction of fire or mowing, and we had 8 cases here. The third example is when you go from one disturbance to another, and this was mostly from stock grazing to fire, and that's what I'll talk about today. And we had 14 cases. And finally, there was old field succession, so switching from cultivation to grazing, of which we had 5 cases. So I'm going to focus on the first 3 today to help us understand the role of disturbance and specifically disturbance type in determining grassland condition. And this helps us to answer that question about can we improve the native composition of grasslands through a switch in disturbance type. So the first switch was abandonment. So here we went, we had a number of different examples. The first one we had going from fire to no fire, and we found that this was generally associated with reductions in richness and site level extinctions. And this is what we would expect based on that literature. Now, the second case of abandonment was when we had the removal of stock grazing. And for most of these studies, we found no changes in native or exotic richness with the removal of stock grazing. So in these examples, we can see that disturbance is important for the maintenance of richness, but it does depend on disturbance type. So the removal of fire, we see reductions in native richness, but grazing doesn't have the same role. There were a few cases where we did see reductions in richness with the removal of grazing, and these were at higher rainfall sites, so it's likely to be related to productivity. But we do not see any improvements in richness with the removal of grazing as well. So it suggests that we have these persistent land use legacies. So the next switch was an introduction of disturbance where there was no disturbance before in recent times. And here we had the introduction of fire and the introduction of mowing. And in both of those cases, we found a general trend of increase in native richness with the introduction of disturbance. Now, this was true for most of the sites, but there was also some evidence that this might also depend on productivity. So in some cases, there were negative impacts by introducing disturbance into sites that hadn't had a recent history of disturbance. And this is likely related to biomass accumulation. And finally, we had that switch from one disturbance to another, and specifically from grazing to fire. And here we're really interested in whether we can, whether reinstating a more historical disturbance regime can improve native plant composition and restoration. And what we found was when you switch from grazing to fire, there was mostly no change in native or exotic richness. And this suggests that stock grazing may have removed many palatable native species, and the vegetation responses to fire were seed bank and dispersal limited. So those species that require fire or are sensitive to grazing may be lost both above and below ground. Now, despite the lack of native species richness response, there were often positive compositional changes noted, so increases in cover and abundance of native species. Importantly, there were no negative effects reported on native species, and there were cases where some exotic species benefit in the short term with this switch in disturbance regime. So from the review, we found that disturbances such as fire and mowing are important for maintaining richness in grasslands. So when we have abandonment, this reduces richness. And if we reintroduce fire and mowing where there hasn't been any recent disturbance, we can then see improvements in native richness. For grazing, however, we didn't see any changes when sites were either abandoned or when disturbance switched from grazing to fire, suggesting that these land use legacies, so these negative impacts of stock grazing, are not overcome simply by switching disturbances. So now I'm going to move on to talk more about the reintroduction of fire into long unburnt sites. So there have been a number of new initiatives in Victoria that have seen cultural burns reinstated for the first time on public land in 150 years. One of these is a landmark agreement between Jaja Wurrung and the state government, and the other is the release of the Victorian Traditional Owner Cultural Fire Strategy. And these initiatives are facilitating First Nations-led cultural burns, and this gives us an opportunity to explore the reintroduction of cultural fire into long unburnt grasslands and grassy woodlands. So we explored this question in grassland and grassy woodland sites in central Victoria. Now these sites are long unburnt and they have a history of stock grazing. And this work was conducted by honours student Michael Cleland. So the study sites you can see on the figure here were all burnt in early winter 2018 by traditional owners as part of the Cultural Fire Program. And we've seen from the review that these grazing land use legacies might be persistent. But in this case, the burns were traditional owner-led, and these differ from typical management burns. So we wanted to see if the reintroduction, in this case of one fire event, can improve native plant composition in these degraded grasslands. So we went out into these sites and we set up quadrats in burnt and unburnt plots soon after fire, and we measured a bunch of environmental variables that you can see on the slide through the growing season. And in spring, we looked at floristics, the first year after fire, and also in 2019, so 1 year after fire. Now, I'll just show you what some of these sites look like. So 2018, you might remember, was a very dry year. So these photos show an example of a quadrat in burnt and unburnt plots in spring. So this is peak biomass for 2018. So in the site at Nadu Hill, you can see it's really, really dry. There's not much going on in either the burnt or unburnt plots. And these are the same plot in 2019. So you can see the burnt plot is actually quite green. I don't know if you can see from this image what the main culprit is here, but we'll come back to that later on. This is a woodland site, so it's very, very low in biomass, and you can see not much going on in burnt and unburnt plots in 2018 and again in 2019. This is Mount Egbert grassland, and again you can see the burnt plots are a little bit greener in 2018, and then this is them in 2019. And again, that same culprit, have you guessed it yet, from 2019 is taking up a lot of the cover. This is Quambachuk, which is further north, and this is a slightly different grassland site with heavier clay soils. This is what it looked like in 2018 and then in 2019. So let's have a look at the data. So we first looked at total species richness in unburnt and burnt plots, and on the left-hand side you can see in 2018, and on the right-hand side in 2019. And here we didn't see any differences in total species richness in burnt and unburnt plots. The different colours and symbols show the different sites. When we look at native species richness alone, again, we see no difference between unburnt and burnt plots in 2018 or 2019. And then when we look at exotic species richness, we do actually see an increase in exotic species richness in burnt plots in that second year after fire. And if you looked at those photos, you might have noticed that a lot of the cover in the burnt plots, that green cover you were seeing was a rhodium species, so an exotic species. Now, we've continued with this work monitoring plant responses to cultural burns in 2021 with Nathan and Amos from Jaja Wurrong, and they're presenting next. So in this case, we had 3 sites, Tang Tang, Mysia and Thunder, again in central Victoria, and we set up 20 quadrats in unburnt and burnt plots at every site. Again, we measured a range of environmental variables and then did our floristic sampling in spring. The sites were burnt in May of 2021. So this is an example of one of the cultural burns at Thunder. Now, these are relatively cool burns, and you can see in the figure in the top right-hand corner, the fuel loads at 3 sites prior to the burns. So you've got quite high fuel loads at Tang Tang, which hadn't been burnt for a long time, and lower fuel loads at Mysia and Thunder. You can also see the temperature just below the soil surface, the maximum that was reached in the fire, and this was 42 degrees at Mysia and 24 degrees at Thunder. So we were interested in the effects of these cultural burns on key plant resources that might affect diversity. So we looked at light availability and soil moisture, and we measured these in burnt and unburnt plots soon after the fire in May, and then in spring with our floristic sampling. And what you can see is that the burnt plots had significantly greater light availability in May, so soon after the fire, and this was retained in October in the peak floristic season. Now, when we look at soil moisture, this didn't differ soon after the fire, but it was a little bit drier in the burnt plots in spring. So let's have a look at the richness data. So we've got, again, total richness here in the different sites in unburnt and burnt plots. And here we found a significant increase in total plant richness in the burnt plots. Now, when we split this into native and exotic, we don't see any difference in native richness between the unburnt and burnt plots. But again, we've seen a significant increase in exotic species richness in burnt plots. And this was mostly due to an increased frequency of occurrence across the site for sort of common exotic species that we see in grasslands, such as the ones pictured here, Vulpia and Trifolium avense. So despite seeing an increase in exotic richness in both of these studies, there's no need for alarm. This can be a transient response to disturbance and likely represents what's going on in the soil seed bank. And these, most of these sites have a long history of stock grazing. In terms of the cultural fire program, the traditional owners are also aware that healing country will require ongoing management that's adaptive and dynamic, and that there's still things to learn in managing these degraded landscapes. So these cultural burns and these studies are important first steps. And of course, there's loads of other benefits in reinstating cultural fire and traditional owner-led management in these areas, which I'm sure Nathan and Amos will talk about next. And we've still got a bit of work to do with looking at species composition as well. So far we've only just looked at richness. So these studies seem to suggest that there may be some limitations in improving native richness when we have switches in disturbance. So we saw that in the review, and we also saw that in our cultural fire studies. And this is likely due to seed and seed banks, which is what I want to talk about next. So the final question I want to address is around seeds and fire. And it's commonly thought that grassland species readily germinate and they don't respond directly to fire cues. So they don't have any specific germination requirements, and they would tend to germinate readily in the absence of any sort of cues. It's also thought that they don't form persistent seed banks. And this, of course, all feeds into our understanding of those land use legacies and recovery of lost species. So do these species persist in the seed bank even when they're lost above ground? And does the type of disturbance matter? So I've talked a lot about disturbance type. We know that disturbance is really important in that process of removal of biomass and creating space for smaller species. But we need to also know whether these grassland species are responsive to fire cues in their germination. And this is what we might expect according to other fire-prone ecosystems, but it hasn't been reported so far for these grassland species. So we tested the response to fire cues, so heat and smoke applied individually and then together in the lab for 55 species that are common in grassy ecosystems. And this work has been led by Josh Hodges, who you can see in the middle image there, as part of his PhD project. And these papers are also available now if you would like to know more about this work. So the key results from this work were when you consider all of the species together in the analysis. So in the figure on the left-hand side, you can first see our results for germination speed, according to our controls in the black, heat alone in the yellow, smoke alone in the blue, and heat and smoke applied together in the green. And what you can first see is that heat and smoke applied together in the green significantly increased germination speed. So these species were faster to germinate when subject to these fire cues applied together. This was much greater than when you apply smoke alone in the blue, and obviously greater than the control and the heat alone in the yellow. Now, if we look at the figure on the right-hand side, this shows the final percent germination. And here we can see that in the blue, smoke alone significantly increased percent germination. We also see a significant increase when you apply heat and smoke together, but this was not greater than smoke alone. So we see this largely as a smoke response because this was greater than the controls in the black, and again, the heat applied singly. So at the community level for the 55 species we tested, heat and smoke increases the speed of germination, and smoke increases that final percent germination. So we also looked at the results considering the main plant families that we had. And just for time, I'm just showing you an example of the Asteraceae here. And these are an interesting group because they're generally thought to germinate pretty readily. And here we can show again, on the left-hand side, you can see germination speed, and on the right, percent germination. So here again, we've got this big increase in germination speed with heat and smoke applied together, bigger than smoke alone and heat alone and the controls. And on the right-hand side, you can see a big increase again in percent germination when you apply heat and smoke, bigger than smoke alone, and smoke alone and heat and smoke are much bigger than heat alone in the yellow and controls in the black. So similar to what the response we were seeing at the community level, a big increase in germination speed with heat and smoke combined, and also smoke alone for percent germination. And some of these species were among the biggest increases that we saw when subject to fire cues. So for example, this Rhodanthe species had a nearly 60% increase in germination compared to controls with smoke and heat combined. And then we've got two species here of Chrysocephalum, so 61% increase for one and 85% increase compared to control when they had smoke and heat applied. And Microceros, an increase of 62% with smoke and heat combined compared to control. And of course, this is an important cultural plant. So we're seeing lots of evidence that fire cues are really important in directly promoting germination of grassland species. Now, the final bit is some early work that we've been doing to address this question of seed longevity. So whether grassland species have short or long-lived seeds and therefore transient or persistent seed banks. Now, to help us understand if seeds have the capacity to form transient or persistent seed banks, we've subject seeds to an artificial aging test. And this work has been started by an undergraduate scholarship student, Nick Lloyd, who's pictured here in the National Seed Bank with his seeds. So these seeds are aged in these temperature and humidity controlled boxes. And this way we can artificially age the seeds to provide us with an estimate of comparative longevity. And this is much faster than using seed burial trials. So what it does is it basically reduces longevity to an observable time span. And then at regular intervals, we take out up to 250 days, we take out the seeds out of the aging conditions and then test them for germination, which you can see in the image on the right. So this is work in progress, so just showing some early results. And the early results only allow us to compare among the species that we've tested. So we can't at this stage say anything about longevity. But for these 20 species here, what this shows is their reduction in germination after 35 days of aging. And we've divided this into forbs in the blue, shrubs in the orange, and trees in the green. And so far we can see a pattern in this life form data where the woody species have only a small proportion of their germination lost by 35 days, and also the forb linum, which had very little reduction in germination. But for most of the forbs, they had lost greater than 50% of their germination at 35 days of artificial aging. Now, as I said, this is only preliminary work, and we need to process this more so that we can start looking at comparative longevity of the seeds and hope we can get somewhere towards answering the question about the potential to form persistent seed banks for these species. So just to wrap up, what I've talked about today is that disturbance type is really important. So disturbance is about much more than biomass removal. We know that temperate grasslands, fire is really important in maintaining richness. We know that if you remove fire from sites that have had regular burning, we'll see negative impacts on richness. We do see that land use legacies are persistent, and so when we introduce fire into long unburnt sites or sites that have had a history of grazing, that restoration may require more than one fire event. So we're only seeing those initial responses of the first reintroduction of fire. But they also might need some more active recovery, such as seed addition, especially for important plants that are desired for restoration. Now, when we start looking at restoring grasslands through some sort of seed addition, direct seeding process, the work that we've done has shown that fire is really important in providing these direct cues in increasing germination for many grassland species. And so this will become really important for restoration and management of grasslands. So that's all for today, and I'd like to thank all of my collaborators who have helped on all of the work that I've talked about today and the funding bodies. And thanks for listening.
Thanks to Jodi. Have a couple of minutes and I'll just introduce our next speakers in that time, if I may. So next of all, we have a joint presentation by Amos Atkinson and Nathan Wong. Amos is a proud Wurundjeri Bangaranga, Dija Wurundjeri, Barapa, Wemba, Darag Wurrung, Nugura Ilam Wurundjeri man, and excuse me for my mispronunciations there. For the last 10 years, Amos has been working in cultural heritage and land management practices, specifically over the last 6 years, reviving cultural fire in Victoria. And Nathan is currently the manager of the Danjak Planning and Strategy with Danjak and Enterprise in the Wurundjung Group. Nathan has worked with the group for the last 5 years and has supported significant expansion of the range and depth of strategy and planning that Wurundjung has undertaken within Victoria. Nathan has worked in the grassland conservation field in both research and practice and has been involved in the purchase, management and restoration of many sites across Victoria. And so I think it's very timely to have Amos and Nathan talk to us after Jodi's talk, which really highlighted the importance of thinking about all the factors that promote restoration of grasslands and grassy woodlands in Eastern Australia in particular. So I'll hand it over to Amos and Nathan.
I hope the technology works and we're all good. Do you want to start? Introduce yourself first. Yeah.
Kappa Gakka, Yori Yora, Amos Atkinson. Welcome. My name is Amos Atkinson. I'm a proud Bangarang, Wiradjuri, Jaja Warang, Barapa, Wamba, Duang Warang, Nurailam, Wurang, Warai, Waiwaru man. I'm a cultural fire practitioner, having a deep spiritual connection to central Victoria, all the way along the Dungala, which is the Murray River, all the way up to Gundagai and Yass, Narrandera into New South Wales.
Cool. Yeah, and I'm Nathan Wong. I'm the manager of planning and strategy at Jandak. I'm Amos's boss and Amos is my boss. That's kind of how we do it. But today what we want to talk about is self-determination and practice. And what we've done previously with a lot of these talks and these things is that we outline the problem and we address what it is that we need to do, but then we don't leave people with the solutions of how to go and solve stuff and what you can do from a sense of actually putting this stuff into practice. And what we want to do with this talk is kind of go through the initial bit of what we've done with some of the work that we've done over the past couple of years around the development of the Right Plant, Right Way strategy with other First Nations in Victoria and the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning. And then we want to take you through a practical example of how we put that into practice. And I hope at the end of it we can leave you with some opportunities which maybe some of you out here might take up and come and walk with us. So if I can, which button do I use? Cool. So during 2020, 21, I'm not sure, these years all get blurry at the moment, the department came to us and said, look, we need to do a review of the revegetation sector in Victoria, building off the work that was being done through the SEED project, and to make sure and understand how that fits into the Victorian context, given the policy and agreements and other things that have been put in place with First Nations. So what we did was we said, yep, we'll be the guinea pigs and we'll take the lead on this. And we did it in a way that made sure that we engaged with other First Nations the way that we'd expect to be engaged ourselves. I think it was challenging for some because COVID was amongst us and it's really hard to get together and talk to people and do things the right way through that time. But we got through the process and I think we've ended up with a really good, strong report that gives us some direction in how the revegetation sector as a whole in Victoria can grow and adapt and become what it needs to be to meet all the needs that we've been talking about, to be able to respond effectively to bushfires, be able to respond to land clearing and do all the other things that needs to be done. So instead of going through the whole report in detail, which I think might be just a bit of browbeating, what I was going to do was just go through the key principles that have come out of the report and what they mean. And then if people are interested, I can circulate the report around to everyone to have a read of. But the main purpose that we had in the report was to actually go out and talk to First Nations people across Victoria, irrespective of whether they're a registered Aboriginal party, irrespective of whether they've got a settlement agreement, irrespective of how the state recognises them, because we recognise them as people. And we wanted to ask them what they felt their participation in the revegetation sector was, how they felt they wanted to be engaged, and what they wanted to do. We deliberately, through that process, made sure that everyone who attended the workshops, and there's a number of people in the room that came along and supported and assisted, was given a Coolaman. And the purpose of that is that the Coolaman's something that there, and it holds life, it holds seed. It's there to support the growing and the bringing of not just plants and other things, but also how we can bring vision, momentum and collaboration to working together on country. So the principles that came out of the workshop, and they've been coming out fairly consistently across a number of other workshops that we've been doing, and reviews of sectors that we've been doing, including some of the animal and cute and cuddly and furry stuff for those of you out there who might care about this, and I don't think there's many in this room, is that First Nations leadership in the revegetation sector is really important. But that's not necessarily from an agency point of view or from who holds the funding, but it's from the governance and the say. It's making sure that there's an equal say in that space, and we actually walk together and we respect one another's voices. It's like there's a vehicle or there's a car, and making sure that First Nations are in the driver's seat, but they don't do it without everyone else, and making sure that everyone else is in the seat. There's too many stories of people being left behind on the roadside and not brought along for the journey. We need to make sure everyone's in the tent. That a cultural approach is taken to healing country. I think it's pretty self-explanatory that we don't just do it through a disconnected science lens of this is how the plant grows, therefore this is how we're going to put it there. We need to understand that plant's place, its meaning and the story behind it. And some of the stuff that's been talked about today, like the distribution of plant species and looking at that, there's a lot of knowledge out there around where plants used to be that doesn't come up in the scientific literature. Doesn't come up in the early surveys, because by the 1830s or 1840s, a lot of plant populations had already crashed in response to some of the impacts of invasion, like smallpox and other things, which dispossessed people and got people off country, reduced fire, plant populations crash. And we expect that what we saw in the 1840s and 1850s is a representation of what's there. It's not. Younger generations are supported to heal country. So where are the kids? We need the kids in this. They need to be part of it, because if they grow up with the ethos and the understanding of how to do stuff right, they'll drive this stuff forwards. You'll notice there's quotes under there that I'm not talking to. They're through the whole report, and they're quotes from people through the workshops as to how they felt about things. Traditional ecological knowledge is protected, respected and used with permission. This is really important to First Nations people. It's something that Queensland's taking the lead on through supporting the Nagoya Protocol and making sure that's part of what they do. In Victoria, we're pushing to try to make sure that happens. That means that First Nations people have an a priori right to the plants and animals that are on their country. Whether that's the genetics, whether that's a seed stock, whether that's the other parts of the puzzle, they've supported and developed that over millennia, and that needs to be respected. Partnerships with First Nations are based on respect and trust. I think the thing that we've learnt, or I've learned over the past 5 years, is that respect and trust isn't just telling one another that everything's going okay. It's also being able to sit down and go, hey, this isn't working, or having an issue with this, and have an open and honest conversation about it. We kind of talk to it. It's like a marriage or a relationship. You've got to have the hard conversations to actually make it work. And that First Nations work together to heal country. I think that's a big thing that we've been learning, or we've been doing over the past, is that too often the state tends to engage with us as individual groups. If we engage together as a collective, it's actually a lot stronger and a lot clearer direction around what needs to be done. And it's a lot easier to understand and there's not whispers about conversations that are happening in the background. And the other part too is that First Nations have the economic opportunities in revegetation and healing country. I think everyone here today is hopefully paid to be here. I know Amos and I are. But how we also set up how we make sure that the structures are in place to actually make it a sustainable sector and make it something that's going to have a long and prosperous future. One of the common threads in feedback from across the sector with this review is on the next slide. I'm going to read this out because it was reiterated over and over again. The revegetation sector in Victoria is currently best described as a small, under-resourced, largely uncoordinated and volunteer-dependent sector. It is expected to rapidly upscale delivery to meet government targets and expectations. However, its lack of the basic supply of seed to meet demand, given the current state of the sector, the goals and objectives of First Nations and the moral and legal obligations of the state to traditional owners and Aboriginal people. There is a significant opportunity to modernise, redesign and reconceptualise the sector to meet the future demands in the way that enables First Nations leadership. And I think that last bit of the sentence, the revegetation sector is a huge opportunity to take all the learnings we've had over the past and to move forward into something that's really exciting, really big, and takes a leadership in how to empower First Nations in having a say over their country. So now I'm going to hand over to Amos, who's going to talk about the next bit. Do you want to do this?
Yeah. So Wurakai Galgungu Right Way Partnership and Planning Project is based on a mutual respect. It is about sharing knowledge, listening and learning. It is a practical and reconciliation that makes space for support and celebrates Aboriginal culture, values and worldviews. Go to the next one. Bush Heritage Australia recognised Jara as the custodians of some of the Karakara Wedderburn landscape. Bush Heritage is committed to a true partnership with Jandak, a Jara-owned land management entity in the planning and management of reserves within these landscapes. Jara, through Jandak, acknowledge and welcome this commitment, respect Bush Heritage for its expertise in conversations, and look forward to a strong, mutually beneficial partnership. The project is a way of Dalkanya Jar, which means healing country, as well as healing people. For Bush Heritage is an acknowledgement of the scars of history and the obligation to be actively involved in healing country. Jara see the partnership as a way to continue to practice customary responsibilities to uphold the obligations of Bunjal's law. Jara's voice is contemporary land management in the region will increase and Jara will be back in the landscape. This is the first partnership of its kind in Southeast Australia, and if it is tested at times, we are committed to negotiating mutually beneficial outcomes. The project is made possible with a grant from the Helen McPherson Smith Trust. Building the partnerships during the COVID meant face-to-face meetings were not possible for most of 2021. Online Zoom meetings were the workshops, 4 planning meetings, 2 steering committee planning meetings, communication team meetings. One on Country Day at Mount Buckra for Victoria-based people. Next one. The approach and scope. Healthy country management framework. Define, plan, work and monitor, adapt, share. The Healthy Country Management Framework is a modification of the conservation standards upon standards for practice of conservation. It puts Aboriginal people at the centre of looking after country with the important values and the threats to country informed by Aboriginal people, views and knowledge. It supports Aboriginal governance structures, adapting planning and management to local context, as well as appropriate terms and language and subjective as well as objective indicators to monitor management effectiveness. The framework supports transformative processes for organisational cultural change. Shared understanding, developing understanding of important concepts, partnerships, spectrum of recognition, intellectual space as transformative. Space, 3 message sticks in the intercultural space. Healthy country principles. Key, trust is the key. Planning, context, review, existing bush heritage, how existing plans talk to each other. Incorporate actions, list in plans, celebrate, make time for ceremony. Vision, goals and aspirations. Make sure the goals are measured. Strategies, regional level. Strategies at the local level, actions measured. If this is done right, this could provide an example for others to how country can be looked after for others. Living treaty and the principles of treaty. Make sure JARA are recognised and acknowledged for contributions and the generations and their journeys. DELP and water bodies have statewide and regional partnerships, plans. Products, next one. Shared strategic plan, overarching co-design product, shared plan, shared vision. Talks to country plan with the values targets, treats principles, documents, shared goals, shared strategies, guided by country plan and bush heritage plans. Seasonal calendars approach can be built with existing knowledge and can be built on over time. The adaptive management is applied in the seasonal calendars, all good communication products. Implementation strategies using seasonal calendars driven by seasonal indicators, talking to one another, weeds, fire, things that need to happen at certain times of the year, describing other plants of strategy and implementation. Marathi share, system to support it, respiratory, where we input measures, i.e. what are the indicators to tell us if we are heading in the right direction. This content doesn't need to live in Marathi, location and system, not the important thing, the content is. Map to show scope of each of the levels of plans would be good. Seasonal calendar work plans, re-centres the JARA knowledge and interests. Looking at country and asking if that it needs, tells you when to harvest seeds, eggs, to hunt things, harvest, burn things. Seasonal calendar ideas, being on country to see when seasons change is important. They are effective a management plan where you should be at certain times, what you should be doing at a certain time, like a management plan but with extra layers on top of it. Action, time frame, content around the outside describing what to be done, indicators, seasonal or progress. Marathi to be used to maintain content, other products to communicate it, reserved and themed plans, example, fire management plan. Other communications. Wurukai Galkangu project approved by Jajawarang Language Committee. Project brandings approved by partners, 2 to 4 page of promotions developed, video being produced. Measuring and sharing, mix of quantitative and qualitative personal stories, interviews with JARA, Jandak and Bush Heritage project teams, other partners, interviewing farmers, capturing stories, who needs to hear the story, sharing in lots of different ways, letterbox from project partners, capturing sentiment of partners, capturing sentiment of partnership, JARA measuring of success, the message stick, partnership, timeline, milestones, online and built, journey considerate of how long it took to get here, might take other mobs longer than we think. Utilise First Nations, people, assembly. Helen McPherson Trust grant requires measuring success. Good and adaptive management requires measuring results. Want to make an impact by sharing lessons learnt with ourselves and with others. Other traditional owner groups, landholders, government, non-government, education and training. Next one. Developing and shared vision, we are learning together, healing country in a culturally appropriate way with more people on country actively practising law and other customs. Using JARA language as much as possible, healing country, Dakanya Ja, country, Jandak. Reconciliation, walking together, respect both organisations and members, people and country. sharing and weaving knowledge, caring and working on country for future generations our children will follow. Growing, rebuilding, leadership and empowerment, stories about opportunity, returning spirits, law exists, Jara back in the landscape, Jandak Wee back on the landscape, managed country historically, starting something that has not been done before. Our lands and waters are in good condition and actively manage to protect our values, law, culture and rights of Dja Dja Wurrung people. Developing timelines, project timelines, partner, personal timelines. What happens next? Measuring and sharing change over time, endorsement, having the right people involved throughout the entire process, seasonal calendar throughout the timeline, 5-year reserve reviews. Bush heritage plans need to think ahead to monitoring and evaluation of project and plan of the reserve health. Woodland, birds, value checking, collaborating with TOs, legacy issues, impacts of climate change, needs more conversation as part of this project plan development. Thank you all.
I think what I'd add on to that is that what Bush Heritage did with this project was they had a reserve management plan. They had a way of doing stuff and they had a process to review it. But what they did was they came to Jara and Jandak and they said, we've got this plan. We realise it's not what you want. So what do you want? And we'll go with that. And now we've got this process that's got a lot of depth to it, a lot of understanding to where it needs to go to. But it's also a well mapped out and understood process. And what Amos has been working on a lot of is how we actually develop seasonal calendars, not just as seasonal calendars that look nice on the wall and that people go, oh, isn't it great that the birds are coming at this time of year and here's the firebirds and it's going to rain now and other stuff, but seasonal calendars that can inform land management and what we do and how we walk on country and how what we do when we wake up in the morning and what we do on a Monday. So when you're going out and you see something's happening and you can observe it, that tells you what to do, not what your works plan says. So the seasonal calendars become the works plan. And that's a process that we're trying to get to. But by demonstrating with Bush Heritage, we set up that process to be able to do it with the state around how they can integrate their horrendous beasts of decision tools into culturally appropriate products and actually for us to take the leadership on those. So I think that's part of the work that Amos doesn't talk about much, but it's really exciting. The other thing that's come out of this too is that the purchase of Mount Buckra, which if any of you have ever worked in central northern Victoria or maybe in Victoria as a whole, know that it's the centre of the universe for wheel cactus. It's one of the main points that it comes out of. It's also a really culturally important place. But the partnership with Bush Heritage allowed that site to be secured, and it also allowed the state to have confidence in investing an enormous amount of money in wheel cactus control out on the mountain. So I think starting on Wednesday, we've got another 20 contractors out there going ballistic on wheel cactus for the next 2 or 3 months. But part of the process of this is actually by working together with Jara, it enables a lot of things to happen. And that's kind of what we wanted to get to with the talks. But we're going to finish up with the last slide. So as a constantly growing organisation, this one doesn't come up in the right orders. We've got a lot of new positions coming up over the last 3 months. I think we've put on 14 new roles. We've currently got project management around joint management and the implementation of joint management. There's an NRM works coordinator. There's a parks and open space apprentice. There's I think that's there's business executive support. There's Jara Centre designers, program managers for policy and other things. We've constantly got jobs coming up where we need people to come and walk with us. We're getting to the stage now where it's not about this and that. It's about how do we do things together, how do we do them better, and how do we make big impacts. So if any of you are out there looking for work, or you know others that are, come and talk to us, because there's lots here, but there's more coming. So thanks heaps.
Thank you very much, Amos and Nathan. I think for plant conservation in this country, we have a very much a shared objective and vision, and I think you've given us a wonderful example of how we can improve what we do and better incorporate or take on board the ideas of Indigenous peoples in doing that. And it's a nice model to see, a nice working example to see. We don't have many of. We have a little bit of time. I think we want to keep the schedule for the online people. Is that right? Yeah, we do. Or we can. No, we're okay. We can move on. Okay. So we can go to our. We'll have some questions again at the end of the session. So if you guys hang around, that'd be excellent. Our next speaker is Laura Canackle from New South Wales Government, Department of Planning and Environment. Laura is a Threatened Species Officer there, based in Queanbeyan, and she works on threatened flora species in the southeast of New South Wales. And today, Laura's going to give us a talk about the Bredbo Gentian following fire. Thank you, Laura.
I'm just going to see how quickly this is. Yep, cool, okay. Hi everyone, my name's Laura Canackle. I'm a Threatened Species Officer with the Department of Planning and Environment for the New South Wales Government. I work mostly on the Saving Our Species program, and I am responsible for about 20 threatened flora species in the southeast of New South Wales, including the Bredbo Gentian, which I'm going to speak a little bit about today. The gentians are a really interesting, unusual and very poorly known group of plants, especially in Australia. And some of the discoveries and challenges that we've had following the Black Summer bushfires with this species in particular. All right, so a bit of a background to the gentians in the genus Gentiana. So worldwide, there are about 400 species in the genus, and there are 4 in Australia. That's the 4 of them there. They're all found in New South Wales and the ACT, and all of them are threatened. So they all have these little star-shaped flowers. They have a bit of an annual habit, mostly, we think, and can be fairly ephemeral. So I'll give a bit of a background about these 4. We've got Gentiana wingercaribiensis, or the wingercaribi gentian. It's only known from 2 sites. One of those sites, unfortunately, the population has succumbed to and been actually impacted by swamp collapse. Therefore, we don't expect to find it anymore, and that was due to some peat mining in the area. And the other population, which is nearby, hasn't been seen since 2004. We've got Gentiana wismanii, or New England gentian. That one is known from the northern tablelands, again only in 1 site, listed as vulnerable. Damn, the bottom's been cut off these ones as well. Prior to 2019, or the 2020 bushfires, it hadn't been seen since 2005, although I've got some intel now that about 90 plants have been seen in the just recently previous season in spring. Gentiana boylanii, or Boylan's gentian, is known from 2 sites, and there's a bit of a question to that because the type location of that is near Delegate in New South Wales. It was first recorded in 1882 by William Boylan and hasn't been seen since, so despite a lot of searching in that area. But the other population is known from the Orroral Valley in the ACT, and that one hasn't been seen since about 1997, despite post-fire searches, and that valley's been burnt a few times since. And of course, Gentiana bredboensis, or Bredbo Gentian, is only 1 site, and it's critically endangered and had a huge 12 plants in 2019 when I first started monitoring the species, and that's pre-Black Summer bushfires. And spoiler alert, we found 280 plants in 2020, which is obviously incredible considering a lot of them have 0 known plants. Right, moving on. So as I mentioned, they're all known from only 1 or 2 locations. They occur in these wet seepage drainage areas along drainage lines and swamp margins. And as we know, those habitats are really susceptible to disturbance. All of these species are suffering a decline, or for what we know from when we've seen them, and so they're also susceptible to extinction, being restricted to these areas. 2 out of 4 of the known, 2 out of 4 of the species of Gentiana were affected by the Black Summer bushfires, and now they're the only ones that we know of that are still extant. And I know that's a huge statement, and I don't want you to kind of come at me about that one, because that's a sweeping statement, and that's also because they are really hard to detect. Detectability is a real big issue. They're, like I said, an annual species, and they have a bit of an ephemeral habitat, so where we know them from, they may not be there next year for whatever reason, we don't know. And the flowers are photosynastic, that's my favourite word I've just discovered, which means that their flowers open in the sunshine. So when you're mucking about looking for them amongst all the biomass and all the other different species that may be flowering at the time, they're pretty tricky to see, which means that if you're just going for a walk in the mountains, and you could easily walk past a population, that would be a really significant discovery. There's a lot of threats to these populations. Those habitats are really susceptible to disturbance. Feral pig damage, that top photo there is taken in the Auroral Valley only a few weeks ago, very close to the Gentiana boylanii site, which we didn't find any plants at anyway. But as you can imagine, if you're a little plant trying to get established in some of these sensitive areas, it would be really tricky with all the pigs around as your habitat keeps getting turned over. Agricultural impacts such as swamp drainage, as we've seen, we have some pretty big losses because of swamp drainage and peat mining. And also cattle trampling and grazing is another one of those kind of agricultural impacts. And I don't need to mention the how vulnerable these species are to events that happen, such as these, and just by having these small single populations. Gentiana bredboensis. So background to this guy, listed as critically endangered. First recorded and described by Laurie Adams in 1971, and it's only ever been found from this one single location on private land near Durangle in the southern tablelands of New South Wales. We have tried really hard to find more populations of it, suitable habitat, nearby habitat, same drainage line, but it's only ever been known from about 5 by 5 metres, this one little location. So obviously that means that it's really vital and crucial that we focus on site management for this area and make sure that nothing happens to it. So we fenced the site in 2009, which was a joint project by Bush Heritage and New South Wales Government to exclude cattle, which were on the property at the time, they're not anymore, and feral pigs, obviously. A bit of a trend of what was happening with this species. In 1996, 1 to 200 plants were observed, which declined to about 50 in 2012. In 2018, which was a really dry drought year, only 2 plants could be found. And then in 2019, like I said, absolute explosion, 12 plants, which is the entirety of the species. I know that we're sort of comparing these things, but there's only 12 plants. Anyway, they were looking a bit weak. We think they may have been held on from the year before, possibly, but yeah, we don't know. So in January of 2020, the bushfires, the good bushfires near Durangle, burnt over half of the known habitat. If you look really closely in that top photo, you can see John Briggs standing, I know you can identify him pretty well from this distance, but he's standing in the middle of the patch where it was known from. So half of the habitat is very fortuitous if you're looking experiment-wise. And yeah, so looking at you can imagine it was fairly concerning for us watching the fires near me, and I know we all were in that summer, watching it kind of encroach and encompass all of that site, and then coming out to find that half of that site had been burnt. We don't really know very much about fire response of Gentiana, especially in Australia at least. And we didn't really know what we were going to find post-fire, but it was pretty crucial that we kept going out there and checking how that habitat was recovering post-fire. It burnt pretty hard. As you can see, it was full canopy consumption in the swamp, and the part that did get burnt. And there's one of those little guys there covered in soot, trying his best. In May 2020, yep, I can see my slides have shuffled a bit too. I started seeing some little tiny seedlings. Again, we don't really have any records of seedlings in Australia, of Australian Gentiana. And I decided to keep the faith in my heart that they were going to be gentians. So looking at as many as there were popping up all over the place, I was pretty excited to see what was going to come that spring. In September, they started dividing up and looking like actually a bit more like gentians. And then in 2020, we counted 279 individuals across the site. So to give you a bit of an indication of the distribution across the site, again, it's a tiny little site. The drainage line, it's only about 40 metres by 20 metres. The bulk of the plants were found in the burnt area, but there was still a jump in numbers in the unburnt area. I've circled where that 5 by 5 metre kind of location was that we've been monitoring. So that was still, it sort of showed that I guess the dormancy breaking mechanism could potentially be both heat and smoke. The biomass removal would have been really important, especially where that 254 plants were. However, the area that wasn't burnt still had a really big jump in plants. So because we had such a great season, we were able to collect a large amount of seed and only over a few visits. So they were flowering really profusely. They were doing their absolute best. And while the plants were flowering, they were also setting seed. The capsules were dehissing while they were still flowering and throwing out seed everywhere. So we could collect it while the capsules were still green, which was really exciting. And we collected about 7,000 seed, and that was only in a few little envelopes. But don't worry, that was such a small proportion of what was actually available for collection, and means that there is so much that just went back down into the soil. You'll have to remember that for later. So much seed in the soil. Those seeds, we sent them to Australian Plant Bank for storage and for research, germination testing, etc. It's one of the little envelopes with the little capsules there, about 250 seeds per capsule, those guys. So the germination test results, upon receiving the seeds, Plant Bank did some testing, and with some really basic stratification, got a 92% success rate with the germination, which is huge considering the previous collection that was made in 2013, they had a lot of trouble germinating it at all. So, I mean, just kind of throwing up some questions here, it could be that the reason that was such a great germination could have been that there was fresh seed and they were germinated fairly quickly. So, filled with enthusiasm and buoyed with the success of the past spring, I went out to undertake the annual monitoring of the gentians. And nice sunny day, and I thought to myself, well, I'm not really sure what's going to happen. It's anyone's game. I don't know the secrets of this plant. No one does. We're just kind of making it up as we go along and seeing what's going to happen. I thought maybe we could have more plants. I mean, all that seed that went into the soil, we could have double, or like, okay, no. Realistically, in the case 280, maybe there's about 50. So I went out there and was quickly baffled by the fact that there were 0 plants at all. There wasn't even a seedling. There was just nothing. And I spent hours scouring the drainage land. I couldn't find anything at all. However, I did go out in January, so this is not in their flowering season, which was November, and found 3 small plants, including seedlings, which is really unusual because seedlings in 2020, when we had the really big jump in numbers, were starting to appear in May, but that was post-fire. But this is, anyway, again, it's just end up getting baffled down these tangents. It just goes to show that we just know so little about the ecology of Australian gentians. I don't have the answers, and I'm hoping that maybe we can have some discussions later. But why didn't they appear? I don't know what it's secret. I don't know why it's not telling me what. The biomass has not increased substantially. It looks exactly the same. There's plenty of space. Everything is here that you want. No signs of habitat disturbance, so there wasn't any pigs that had got in. There was no grazing that was apparent, and no pathogens, no weed incursions. There's been no new threats. So moving on to, okay, well, we need to sort of think about what we're going to do with this particular species. Maybe how flexible are these guys with regard to flowering time? Are we looking at the wrong time of year? Do we need to be looking really regularly? Given that they have such an annual life cycle that could be really quick, are they really responsive to disturbance? Or are they, you know, from germinating to flowering and seeding, could that be really quick? Are we missing them? Or did I miss them? So can they flower at varying times given the right conditions? How long can this seed stay viable for? So we now know that this seed can stay viable for at least 20 years in the sphagnum bog. So in that case, what's the genetic variability amongst those seed, and what's the genetic variability in the population? Can they self? Do they maybe not open and they can still kind of be pollinated by themselves? And really importantly, how can this new information be applied to the species of Gentiana, so Winter Caribbeensis and Boylanii, that haven't been seen in the past 20 years? Is there a way that we can stimulate germination? Do we need to burn them, or burn them again in other situations? Or is there another biomass removal mechanism that we can use that would work, and then maybe rain? And so yeah, it gets a little bit confusing about what actually is going on here. And in that case, can we use the information to better predict where they might occur? So could we focus our targeted survey effort on areas that have burnt and then have had good follow-up rain? Could that be a way to look forward to it? And in that case, we need to really kind of work out where the best places are that we're going to look for them, because they could be anywhere if they're going to just throw spanners in the works and flower whenever they want to. So that's kind of it. Obviously a big thanks to John Briggs. He's obviously retired now, but still very much involved in these projects, and he's been pushing it along for the last 20 years and passes it on to me, and something amazing happens. So I thank him anyway, and some other partners in this.
Thank you, Laura. It just goes to show that we need a lot more work on gentians still. Our next speaker in this session is Bradley Desmond. Bradley is a Senior Project Officer with the Australian Seed Bank Partnership. He assists with the coordination of national and international conservation programs related to ex situ seed conservation, capacity building and research collaborations to secure Australian plants for future generations. Today, Bradley's going to talk to us about a case of fire, collaborate for conservation. Thanks, Bradley.
Alrighty. Hi, everyone. As Tony said, my name's Brad Desmond, and I'm the Assistant Coordinator with the Australian Seed Bank Partnership. Before I get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting today, both here in Albury and for the people online, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. So today I'll be giving you an overview of how the Australian Seed Bank Partnership has worked to support plant conservation and recovery across Australia since the 1920 summer bushfires. I'll be highlighting the outcomes and challenges of our work, explore the importance of collaboration for conservation, and discuss how our work provides crucial material and knowledge for conservation management in the face of future threats. So to provide a quick overview of who we are, as you can see, the Australian Seed Bank Partnership is an alliance of 15 organisations and growing. It includes conservation seed banks at Australia's leading botanic gardens, as well as some state environmental agencies, non-government organisations, and the Millennium Seed Bank Partnership. Our partnership consists of at least one partner in each state and territory, which allows for national collaboration and for our goals to be achieved on a countrywide scale. With the inclusion of Greening Australia, the APCC and the Millennium Seed Bank, we have strong ties with Australian plant networks and international agencies that provide us with invaluable support to conserve Australian plants. A main focus for the partnership is to secure seeds in ex situ conservation collections to ensure plant populations against the risk of threatening processes. Seed banking is one of the most widespread and cost-effective approaches to plant conservation that can capture genetic diversity of a population and give land managers options for future restoration and translocation efforts. The partnership is also dedicated to seed science and research. As part of the process of collecting and storing our seed, our partners undertake conservation actions such as field surveys for plant health and develop germination protocols in the lab. And these actions help us to achieve our vision, where Australia's native plant diversity is valued, understood and conserved. So in the aftermath of the 1920 fires, seed banking as a conservation management option has become even more significant, with over 10 million hectares burnt and a proportion of EPBC listed species being severely impacted. The Australian Government's Bushfire Expert Panel prioritised 486 plant taxa as requiring immediate action to assess impacts and support their recovery. Our national network was uniquely placed to respond to this event. The collective expertise and experience across the partnership gave us a platform to assist with monitoring and securing prioritised species in the 2 years post-fire. So as a result of this network, we were able to secure $3.2 million in funding to begin 6 bushfire recovery projects across the entire country. Funding was primarily provided by grants provided through the Australian Government, the UK Government, NGOs and some corporate sponsorship. The work involved 9 conservation seed banks in each state and territory, as well as with the APCC, who provided us with some great communication products. To date, we've successfully delivered 3 projects and 3 are ongoing. So across the 6 projects, there were 4 main conservation actions that our partners focused on, and those include flora assessments, seed collection, germination trials, and propagation for use. And I'll give you a bit of a rundown about what each of those activities entails. So rapid flora assessments are surveys of target species and areas that help ascertain vegetation condition, species abundance, population size, and presence of things like pests and disease. So to ensure that there was a consistent collection of information across our partners and projects, some staff at the Australian Plant Bank developed a standard assessment methodology which was used by each of our seed banks through the projects. And here we have Jenny from the South Australian Seed Conservation Centre doing an assessment for Herbatia globosa on Kangaroo Island. Data from these assessments provides seed banks and conservation agencies with some really important information about fire impact and species recovery, which can then inform bushfire response and management in the event of future burns. As I mentioned earlier, germplasm collections made through our projects provide an insurance for flora against future loss and ensure that genetic material is available for conservation and research. And here we have Tom and Emma from the National Seed Bank in the ACT collecting material from a native blackthorn in the Wombian Karst Conservation Reserve. Now, leaving ample seed to replenish the soil seed bank and provide food for native animals is a serious consideration when we make our collections, and it remains a priority for all of our projects. Germination trials provide our partners with information about the viability of their collections and help to unveil the process to germinate plants from seeds. As I'm sure all of you know, each species has specific cues that stimulate their growth, such as heat, scarification, or chemical treatments like smoke. It's critical that germination protocols are developed and then documented for each species following their collection to allow seed banks to efficiently germinate their stored material if they're required for restoration. And here we can see propagants of the Brussels spider orchid being trialled with a fungal symbiont at Kings Park. These seeds were collected in 1999 from a subpopulation that no longer exists. So these germinants represent a very precious source of genetic diversity. Oops. Our projects also involved propagation of seedlings or growing on of germinates from those germination trials. These were used in a number of different ways across our projects. So for example, in WA, seedlings of a threatened Dawinia sclerosa were planted into a seed production area in Albany in 2001. That's what you can see here. These areas allow additional seed to be harvested and banked for future conservation work. And plants grown for our projects were also used in activities like translocations, reintroductions, and in living collections in botanic gardens. Whoops. Now, when we compiled the outcomes from each of our partners for the 6 projects up to March 2022, we discovered that our collaboration had led to a whopping 948 conservation actions for Australian flora. And not surprisingly, seed collection was the largest share of those activities at 38% of the total. If we look at a breakdown of our actions by our 6 projects, you can see that the 3 completed projects on the left, which we worked on just after the bushfires, focused largely on rapid flora assessments and emergency seed collections. Now, the rapid flora assessments occurred where individuals or populations were heavily impacted, and emergency seed collections occurred where short-lived species such as bushfire ephemerals were observed fruiting in burned areas or where populations were at risk of future fires. If we also look at the ongoing projects on the right, these have a larger focus on germination trials and propagation, as we got a better understanding of the impact of the fires and could put more effort into that type of work. If we also have a look at the taxa that we worked on, we've completed conservation actions for a total of 521 across the 6 projects to date, and of these we've banked collections for 282. Of the total taxa we worked on, 141 of those were also on the Bushfire Expert Panel's priority list, and that equates to conservation actions for around 29% of those flora. We also worked on 93 EPBC listed taxa and banked collections for 57 of those. And if we go up a classification level of the 521 taxa, that represents 60 different plant families. And here you can see a breakdown of the number of taxa we worked on by the family. The 8 most common are labelled here, and they make up around 64% of the total taxa that we targeted, with the most common families being the Metaceae, Fabaceae, and Proteaceae. Just quickly, I wanted to touch on the amazing effort of the partnership over the last 2 years. You can see here that in our first decade as a partnership, our partners banked over 1,400 plant species and completed over 1,500 conservation actions. But when we compare this to the last 2 years, you can see how much extra effort we've expended to help conserve Australian plants after the bushfires. Much of it delivered during rolling COVID lockdowns and from the subsequent impacts of La Nina. This represents not only a significant contribution to the understanding and conservation of our native flora, but also an increase in the capacity and capability of our partners to be able to respond to crisis. And in times like this, I think that's really something to be proud of. So to give you a species-specific example of the work we've done, I'll introduce you to the pink flannel flower, which we can see Peter here collecting. This species is a bushfire ephemeral, meaning it blooms after fire and therefore doesn't flower regularly every year. After bushfires, there was a mass emergence of this in the Blue Mountains, as we've already heard today. And as part of one of our initiatives, the Rare Bloom Project, staff from the Australian Plant Bank in Mount Annan travelled to Katoomba, where they collected and banked over 500,000 seeds. Using these seeds, which you can see there in the top left, the team also undertook trials to develop the species germination protocol, and they went on to grow over 70 individuals that were planted last month at Mount Annan and are being used as a living collection and a seed production area. So after a whirlwind few years for the partnership, we wanted to share some of our challenges to inform future conservation work. As I'm sure they did for most people here today, COVID restrictions delayed our field and lab work as partners weren't able to travel or access their workplaces. Seed banks with a smaller footprint had limited capacity to host their staff in line with social distancing rules, all while the BAU work was continuing and bushfire work was ramping up. While our partners were able to adapt to those challenges, it unfortunately did redirect time and resources away from the work that limited our overall capacity. The current La Nina event also delayed progress on the eastern coast, as we found that species exhibited delayed fruiting and flowering due to the cooler and wetter conditions. More time and resources therefore went into recollection efforts and targeting alternative but available species. Another challenge for us was short project timeframes related to grant funding. Those restricted project periods didn't allow longer-term monitoring of species recruitment and survivorship, as well as their time to maturity. This data could have provided vital information for future seed collections, as well as best timing and location for things like prescribed burning regimes. The shorter timeframes also added pressure when establishing germination protocols and growing seedlings, especially where we'd only collected limited seed because it was the only amount that was available, or where there was issues with breaking seed dormancy. We'd like to acknowledge that the flexibility from some of our project partners where it was available, but to address that in future projects, we'd recommend that there be a minimum 2 to 3 year time frame be assigned to projects like this. In terms of our learnings, number one is that collaboration is key. Without our established partnership, the breadth and scope of project outcomes we were able to achieve wouldn't have been possible. Not only is the national collaboration between all of our partners important, but so are the regional collaborations for each of the partners. That includes involvement from local communities, Indigenous groups, stakeholders and volunteers. And going even broader, our international collaborations with the Millennium Seed Bank Partnership have also allowed some amazing skills and knowledge to be shared amongst us, which can only help in protecting our plants moving forward. Another thing that we learned is to build adaptability into our projects. So having extendable project timeframes is really useful to ensure that project targets are met despite issues with low seed set or the dormancy that I mentioned before. Having flexibility for the target taxa and the sites is also important, because several times partners had to switch focus to different species or areas due to changed weather conditions or because sites were inaccessible due to fire damage. So having flexibility built into project planning allowed our overall targets to be met despite the challenges that I mentioned earlier. On an agency level scale, we encourage further thought on developing flexible strategies to quickly and efficiently respond to future threats like bushfires. Unprecedented events are becoming more common, so having options to scale up facilities and staff to cover the BAU work while also responding to the work related to the new threats is key to achieving conservation outcomes, and that's especially apparent in the face of our changing climate. They say knowledge is power, and for conservation that is also true. The more we know about the distribution, fire response and germination of the plants that we're trying to protect, the better armed we are against potential pressures. For all of the collections that we've made, our partners upload data to the Australian Seed Bank online, which we're actually in the process of updating at the moment. And then that feeds into the Atlas of Living Australia for anyone to access. Information we collect is also shared with local land management organisations and with Q's data warehouse. By sharing what we know, we hope to make it easier for future conservation practitioners to do what they do best. So just in wrapping up, I hope you have a better understanding of the ex situ plant conservation activities that the partnership's been able to complete since the bushfires. I'd like to thank our project funders and sponsors and donors that are on the screen. And I also want to acknowledge and thank our partners for all their hard work over the last 2 years and for allowing me to share their stories with you. To learn more about our projects and partners, please feel free to visit our website and follow us on social media. And I'd be happy to answer any questions during the session, or feel free to shoot me an email with the email on screen. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Bradley. It's another excellent example of people working on plant conservation sort of taking up the challenge after a big event like the 2019-20 fires and tackling a whole lot more work in a very short period of time. And that's happened in a number of our speakers today, and I'm really quite impressed by the degree and extent of plant conservation work that's currently going on. Our final speaker in this morning's session is Dr. Melinda Pickup from Greening Australia. Melinda has a PhD in conservation genetics at ANU. Before she joined Greening Australia, Melinda was a university researcher and teacher in Australia, Austria and Canada. She's committed to seeing the best available science implemented into restoration and conservation practice. And today Melinda is going to talk to us about From the Ashes, predicting the need for restoration in fire-affected landscapes.
Sorry, I had to enter stage left a little bit differently because we had a few technical issues, so hopefully this all works okay. So first I'd like to acknowledge the collaborators on this project. This is certainly not done in isolation. So we worked a lot with Team McDonald on this project, Sam Craigie, who was the leader of Project Phoenix, Juan Pablo Riveros at Greening Australia, who did a lot of the GIS work, and Summer Bailey-Kerber, who helped me with a lot of the plant trait work. And should acknowledge too that Rachel Gallagher provided a lot of the data at the beginning of this project, and we definitely used information from the expert panel according to the species that were fire affected. So we've heard a lot about the fires today and we've all experienced them, and we know that these were really unique. I mean, Australian landscape is fire prone. When fire is fairly common, we know species actually need it. But these fires were unique in the sense that they were much larger, their scale, their severity, what the intensity that we saw these areas burn, the impact on native flora and fauna communities, and in terms of the types of communities that were burnt. Is that okay? Oh, of course, sorry. Yep, there we go. So of the millions of hectares that were burnt, I mean, a lot of these were our sclerophyll vegetation types, which are used to fire, but we saw rainforests burn, we saw alpine areas burn, areas that aren't normally subject to fire. And of course, when we think about the threatened ecological communities that were affected, 35% of the 88 nationally listed TECs were burnt, and there was 19 we had more than 10% of their extent burnt in these fires. So really, really significant. And we also know that these wildfires, as people have talked about today, happened in the context of a lot of other stressors that were going on. So a lot of other threats in terms of pests, disease, habitat fragmentation and drought. So we should also just acknowledge, though, that wildfires, when we think about their severity and scale, I mean, they're not all necessarily damaging, of course. That depends on the community, and as we've seen today, really some good examples of how incredible resilient these ecosystems are and these vegetation communities and the regeneration that we've actually seen. So we think about what restoration or what interventions may be required. This can vary from everything from natural regeneration, so just protecting the threats, just letting it come back on its own, through to seed introduction. So this is where Project Phoenix came into it. Now, Project Phoenix as a whole was to look at the native seed sector, and it was obviously a whole range of activities, of which the one I'll talk about today was only one of those. But it was really asking these questions about how can the sector respond when these catastrophic events happen, and how can we actually increase the supply of seed that might be needed for restoration if that's required in bushfire-affected areas. So this is in understanding and improving the capacity of the sector to respond, and understanding the seed needs. So today I'm going to be focusing on understanding the seed needs. How do we step back and say, okay, the area was so large that was burnt, what do we need to do and what seed might be required? So this kind of led, when we saw those fires, lots of big questions about, well, what actually is the role of seed in post-fire recovery? Do we need to put seed in the systems, or will they come back on their own? Can restoration strategies be used to facilitate post-fire recovery? And how do we actually predict when intervention is actually required? So these are the kind of the questions that we'll be addressing with our models. So if we looked at the fire extent, we've seen variations of this image today in this session. It was huge, and we think about these red areas being the ones where the whole 1 by 1 kilometre cell was burnt in the fires. So when we think about this massive problem, we think about the number of threatened ecological communities that were within this burnt area, we kind of needed to step back and go, okay, well, how could we take an ecological triage approach essentially with this? We only have limited resources. We know that seed is precious. Everybody in this room recognises that. We don't want to use it unnecessarily. How do we use it to get the best gains and use it most effectively? So this led to the need to devise a framework to assess the need for intervention based on a few variables that we might have some data that would inform some models. So the first of those is, as we've talked about, Rachel talked about this, Tony spoke about this as well, the pre-fire conditions. So what was actually happening and what condition was the vegetation community in leading up to a fire event? And then we can think about, okay, well, what about the severity of the fire that actually came through? Then we can think about its landscape context. This is important not only from a genetics perspective to think about the genetic resilience, but also these threatening processes and other degradation that might happen and encroach on a particular area that might reduce its regenerative capacity or capacity to come back. And the last one is the community composition, obviously the species that are in there and their fire traits. So we wanted to take our framework and model, and people have discussed this today, and we know it's important when we're thinking about a vegetation community. We want to know about the fire response of the species that make up that community, and these can be either obligate seeders, which we've spoke about earlier. These are the species obviously that just come back from seed that don't resprout. You might have your facultative seeders, which go both ways. They can either come back from resprouting or seed, but sometimes one of those responses might dominate, or you have your resprouters that don't necessarily come back with seed, but will resprout after a fire. So there's a wealth of information for some species out there in terms of how they respond to fire. So we wanted to combine that with thinking about, well, what are the variables that might reduce the regenerative capacity of a community? And these are things like the appropriateness of the fire regime that's been before, so the fire frequency, the time since last fire, and as other people have spoken about, for obligate seeders, obviously there needs to be enough time for those plants to go from seed to reproduction and reproduce enough to replenish the seed bank before that next fire comes through. This also can affect resprouters in terms of the resources that they have available to them to resprout and the age of the stand. Also herbivory from native and exotic herbivores, disease, competition with weeds, grazing pressure, and then we're thinking about small and isolated populations have issues around their genetic resilience, and then broadly habitat modification. So if there's ways that we can think about this and integrate that into our framework, we might have a better idea about the communities that might be doing okay and responding all right, and the ones that might need some assistance. So what we tried to do with this project is essentially bring together the fields of fire ecology and restoration to think about how we might want to intervene. So the SARA standards were developed last year and revised by the Standards Reference Group, and that gives us a really nice way and a framework to think about the type and the degree of intervention that's required. So on this diagram here, we've got the spectrum of increasing damage or degradation of a community, and that can go from low. And if you've got low degradation in your community, it seems to be doing okay, then essentially all you really need to do is protect it from existing threats and then leave it be. But you might, as you move up that increasing spectrum of degradation, then you might move up into facilitated regeneration. And this is the case where you still really, most of the time, will not need seed unless it's a particular species of conservation concern, generally for that community, but you might need to facilitate regeneration by doing things like going in there and managing the site. You might want to burn it. You might want to manage the weeds, and that essentially unlocks the potential for that system to come back. Then you're moving up, and we're getting into the stage where we might require some seed input. And this is where we go to combined regeneration and reintroduction. So you might go in first, have a staged approach where we go in, you do some facilitated regeneration, clear out some weeds, do some management interventions, essentially test the regenerative potential that's there, see what comes back, do an assessment. If there's anything that's still missing, then that's when you would be introducing seed. And then the last, when you've got the highest level of degradation, this is where you're looking at reconstructing the whole community. Now in a bushfire context, this is very, very unlikely that you would need to do this, but how we can think about this in terms of bushfire recovery is like for our existing patches, would we actually want to improve their chances by, placing vegetation buffers around them, reconstructing habitat to do that, increase their patch size, think about connectivity across the landscape, or actually have insurance populations. This is how we can think about the reconstruction side where the seed inputs are really high and you're creating it from scratch. And I said all of the things when we're thinking about restoration, our goal and where we're heading to is always according to the reference community for that particular community you're working in. So what we tried to do with this one is take a step back and we say, okay, we know that there's a list of things that it can affect the community and how it's performing even before that disturbance goes in. And these are things like we discussed, like a fire frequency, and the kind of fire history that is in a site will depend whether that's appropriate or inappropriate, will depend on the species composition, of course, that's in that community, and the community type generally, whether it's more fire resistant or fire tolerant or fire sensitive. The drought, whether it's generally more degraded than others, and that includes grazing effects as well. We've heard a bit about those today, and that's something I'm not going to be talking about, but it's in our Phoenix report, is how you might think about what seed needs are required, whether you have a situation where we've had grazing or not. General connectivity across the landscape. We use distance to cleared areas essentially as a proxy for weed loads, knowing that weeds will actually reduce the capacity for a system to come back, and that we know that the propagule pressure in terms of what a site may experience is probably related to areas that weeds can disperse in from, which is more likely to be cleared areas. And then there's the disease elements, and we've heard a bit about that today. So what we can do is we can look across all these variables and make an assessment. All right, knowing what we know about all of these, can we come to a decision about what we think this recovery potential of this community might be, whether it's low, moderate or high? And that sort of feeds into where we think about, well, what could we predict the regenerative potential to be here, even before disturbance? And then we say, all right, now this fire's come through, and we have data on fire intensity, which we can bring back into this mix here. So whether it's a low intensity fire or high intensity or very high intensity, as we saw with a lot of the black summer fires, that will interact with its regenerative potential that we predicted to find what we might think that community will be. And again, this is where you have to stop with our predictive models, and it's now really only through assessment that you can actually go and find out what's happening. So here's where you might go to a site and you say, okay, well, now we need to see if our models are true. What's the level of regeneration? Are there missing functional groups or species? And are there species in there that are likely to respond to facilitated regeneration? And from that decision tree, you can go through and say, okay, we think this restoration approach is required. Protecting, managing threats, we might need facilitated regeneration, or we might need a combined approach where we actually need to input some seed. So this was the basis of our model. So I'm just going to give you an example of moving it to New South Wales in the wet sclerophyll forest of the upland basalt eucalypt forest. It's just of some of our processes that we did. We did this for 19 threatened ecological communities that were burnt more than 10% in the fires. So this is just one of them. So these double donuts, you're probably going to see these a couple of times in my talk today. So with the inner ring of the donuts, this is where we're looking at the life forms that make up this community. And of course, we got the species lists from the general listings for a community type, knowing that they're not perfect. There's going to be species that are in and out of those, but that gave us a point of reference for the reference community. So we can look at the bluey-green ones, excuse me, and think about the herbaceous species. What proportion of the community is herbaceous? Shrubs is the orange, trees are the green, and so the yellowy orange is the climbers and vines. And if each of those life history groups, we can think of what's the fire response of within each of those. What proportion are resprouters? What proportion are obligate seeders? Which ones are facultative seeders, and which ones don't we know? And so the composition in terms of life form and life and their fire response is going to vary between communities, and this will really help us identify, well, which species do we think might have dropped out of this system and maybe requiring intervention versus some that may be coming back. So what we did is we had some data available to us, not across all of the variables, but we had data on fire frequency. We could think about this in sort of fire interval is what we used here, and we could make a general assessment of how appropriate or inappropriate that is based on the primary juvenile period from what the information we had. And of course, these are caveats, and a lot of these communities, I mean, for some communities we know a lot about this, for others we don't, but we sort of had to work with the information we had. So in the graph here, we've got the primary juvenile period in years, and it's the frequency and for the different life history groups. So again, the colours are the same. So we've got our herbaceous, where your primary juvenile period is a lot shorter than your longer lived shrubs and trees. So this kind of helps us to interpret which species might be okay within particular fire regimes versus not. And then, of course, it comes the context of what the fires leading up to the fires, and that was drought. So we decided to use here the Bureau of Meteorology data we downloaded, and we looked at rainfall percentiles in the 5 years leading up to the fires. And we did that because we wanted to think about the impact of drought on the plant condition and also their seed, knowing that under drought that plants are more likely they're not going to have the resources available to produce seed, or they may have lower seed set, which will impact their ability to come back. And then the distance to cleared areas as a proxy for weed load. And then we put this in our GIS spatial model, and we could just have a look at this and to think about, okay, knowing this was all base analysis, we did this on the may occur and the likely to occur extent of these threatened ecological communities. This is the likely to occur for the wet sclerophyll here, and the colours represent our priority. So the red areas are the highest priority. So the areas that come up in our model as having the most inappropriate fire regimes might have had the highest drought and closest to cleared areas. So what this provides for our estimates of intervention is we might ask then, okay, well, can we just set this up to then go and assess this and say, are there areas, the green areas, which is probably doing okay? These ones we might just need to protect, watch them, manage the threats, and they should be okay. What about the areas that might need facilitated regeneration? So going in there, controlling the weeds and seeing what comes back. And then there might be others where, because of inappropriate fire regimes in the past, for drought, they might be close to areas where they're going to get a lot of weed load. We might actually need this combination of facilitated regeneration and reintroduction. So again, it just provides a method for trying to think when the problem is huge, the areas are vast, we're talking about thousands and thousands of hectares, how do you decide where to go and what you need to do? This at least provides you with an idea of being able to move forward and actually just go and do those on-ground assessments. And I think the thing is what is great now is there's a lot of data coming out from assessments, so we could bring this in and just try and start to test. Do these models, are they actually good in terms of predicting what happens? And I don't want you to look at the details of this specifically. I just want you to essentially go to the double donuts again and just cast your eye, knowing that the colours all relate to the different life history groups. So what we tried to do is, of course, this is a very broad framework, and that's what it was intended to be, is something we could broadly apply to different vegetation types, but have a similar approach in trying to understand what may require intervention or not. And all our models that came out of it, that prioritisation was always within a vegetation community, not between them. But what we can see from here is that if you're going to a subtropical rainforest where it's dominated by trees, shrubs, climbers and vines, we had very limited actually knowledge at that stage about fire response. Of course, they've got a lot more understanding now that's been monitored, but that's a very different composition to if we go to the Eastern Stirling Ranges and go across to WA, where it's all shrubs and herbaceous in the heath and the thicket there. And then when you go to the grassy woodlands, where obviously you've got your overstory, you've got your scattered eucalypts, but the predominant vegetation, the type is your herbaceous, or that's where all the diversity sits in the herbaceous layer. So this model was supposed to be able to be applied to different types of vegetation communities based on the functional traits of the plants within them. So if we're just thinking about predicting and facilitating regenerative potential, again, we really wanted to bring together these fields. Can we apply what we think about in terms of restoration and bring that together with all the literature that's on fire ecology? And bring this into where we have plant traits, thinking about those that are going to be more fire sensitive and fire tolerant. And then bringing this into also the context of knowing that we need to be thinking about weed management, and that the goal at the end of the day is we want to minimise our inputs. Seed is so precious, we just want to use it most effectively and efficiently to maximise the outcome. So we really want to do this through targeted seed use. So with this model, I mean, again, a model is only ever as good as the data that goes into it. So there's definitely some limitations here. And if we refined it and used some of the state-based fire history data, we could probably refine it even further. But essentially, all they are is predictive tools. And so what we could do if we do predict them, we go and ground truth them and they do work, we might be able to think, okay, well, we could use this to say, well, can we actually prioritise certain areas knowing that their composition and there's particular species in there we want to go and look for and say these ones we think are the ones that may be dropping out and we want to intervene. And we really want to go and test this using data on the ground. But these types of models also enable us to look forward as well. So we can hear, and there's been some talk about this already today, about how do we predict communities that might be vulnerable to future events. So we could use this data and say, okay, well, this is the TEC. This is the proportion that was burnt last time. This is what's left. If this area was burnt in the next 5 years, this is what we might expect, and this is what the species we may require to actually implement. And so it enables us to be ready. We've talked about all the excellent work that's gone on with biobanking and seed collections. Well, this may enable it to be strategic, to know that areas we can preserve communities and the particular species, knowing that some of those species will probably be okay, but others will be at risk if a fire came through in the next 5 years or 10 years. So I'd like to thank everybody for your attention today. Please get in touch if you've got any questions, and happy to answer them now. And we've also got a much larger report if you feel like going into any of the details of your favourite TEC. So thanks for your time.
Thanks, Melinda. It's timely to have a look at ecological communities rather than just species, and it's nice to see how you can think about prioritisation in terms of actions that are needed for that group. We now have 10 minutes for questions before we break for lunch, so I'll throw it open to the floor if anybody would like to ask any of our speakers a question. Peter, we'll start with you. Thanks.
Thanks, Tony. Hello. A question for Jodi. We've got Jodi online. Yep. Just a question about change in land use or the land use legacy around grasslands. One of the big disturbances that I see is change in soil nutrient status. So I'm talking superphosphate, lime. Does Jodi think any of the interventions that we're talking about, like fire, for example, would they have any impact to improve the native grass diversity in those altered soil profiles?
We won't have sites that we're looking at are not so degraded in the application, adding sugar and trying to reduce success with that. Soils that are really high in nutrients. They're
I don't know if you can hear us, Jodi, but unfortunately technology has beaten us and you were breaking up quite a bit there. So just Peter can perhaps ask you that question in person or in some other way.
Can I just add something onto that?
Yes, certainly.
Is this working or we're not? We have this one working or not? Doesn't matter. Here we are. Yeah, part of what we're finding too with putting fire into places is that we have got higher nutrient loads and legacies from the management in the past. Is that it just takes more fire and more frequent fire to actually keep things in order, to keep the weeds under control. And the native grasses respond quite well to fairly frequent fire. I think one site we've been burning on about a 6 to 7 monthly basis, and that's going forward at a great rate of knots.
That's coming.
Microphone. Thanks, Amelia. This is for Amos and Nathan as well. I noticed on one of your slides, you had a focus on a personal versus a company timeline and objectives, and I thought that was a really interesting approach, that you had two separate timelines. Do you have any tips for how you might manage maybe what are competing goals or objectives? Or not?
I think one of the really important things, because with us we've got, I guess there's Jara who work within Jandak, and then there's Jara who also have a right to have a say over their country, and some people will be working in other jobs because that's their choice. You need to make sure that you consider it and you hear everyone's voice. So it's just the expectations at the start when you start a project. So we had some really good discussions with Helen McPherson Smith at the start of the project that we were doing, and Bush Heritage enabled that to say, well, this isn't going to be a project that's a 2 or 3 year project and we'll wrap it up and we're done. This is a project that we need to take time to talk about and find our way through. And hopefully it'll take 2 to 3 years, but it also may not.
and I think that's the really important thing, is to make sure that people don't feel under pressure to have to be there and have to be in each conversation, and just have the confidence that there's the time and the space to do things right.
Bob Atkinson from Sydney. Also for Nathan and Amos. The Victorian government's the first government in Australia to really commit to a treaty process. And I'm wondering, to what extent has that provided you with opportunity to expand your strategy and give it more voice? And not just in terms of Indigenous leverage in restoration processes, but also in changing consciousness among some of the other partner organisations in that treaty process? And how generalisable do you think that might be in other jurisdictions?
I think part of the journey that Jara's been on has been before treaty started. There's been commitments from the state through legislation and regulation to actually recognise that traditional owners are actually people who have rights and have never ceded sovereignty, and in signing up to the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, there was commitments made on behalf of the nation and states which actually need to be followed through on, and treaty's part of that process, but it's not just that. That's just not all the process. And I think that over time, as agencies and other parts of government understand how to do things the right way, consistent with Australia's obligations, really cool stuff starts to happen. So it's more people opening their minds to the opportunity in empowering First Nations, as opposed to looking at it as something that's additional or a bit harder. If you take the leap of faith and go and have a chat with a yarn with your local mob, you'll make some really cool stuff happen.
No more hands? Just before we break for lunch, I have something to read out. So our lunch today is supported by Stringy Bark Ecological, an ecological consultancy business based in Armidale on the northern tablelands of New South Wales. They have considerable expertise in ecological restoration, environmental management, and survey and management of threatened plant species, hence their relevance today. Recent projects they've been working on include work on Homoranthus darwinioides, Pterostylis metcalfii, Baronia rapandra, and Lepidium peregrinum. Stringy Bark Ecological specialise in restoration and management of grasslands and grassy woodlands and forests. So we thank them for our lunch today. And before we break, just thank you to all the speakers today, and Jodi, who's online, for their excellent and informative talks. So put your hands together for them. Thank you. And if you haven't asked any questions, grab those speakers while you can for those in person, and anyone online will try and make a way of tallying up any questions you have to take to those speakers as well. Thank you.